ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
If you've ever driven up through Central Australia, it's really easy to let your mind wander and to imagine some awful worst-case scenario taking place, particularly if you're like me, a charming urbanite with zero bush skills. You'd be on some kind of narrow, dusty outback road. There'd be no truck stop or homestead. There'd be the big sky over red dirt going on forever, and nothing as far as the eye can see. Then suddenly your engine would conk out and the four-wheel drive rolls to a stop and the silence creeps in. And you wonder how long until someone works out you're not where you're supposed to be. This is the kind of situation Steve Ellis is trained to survive in. Steve is a survival expert and instructor. He trains civilians and Defence Force personnel in bushcraft and in long-lost skills like celestial navigation. And he also loves taking groups of veterans and their descendants along the Kokoda track, where shell casings still line the pits along an already treacherous walk. And he's been through some of his own worst-case scenarios that he was lucky to emerge from alive. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Richard.
What are some of the fundamental elements of survival in the wilderness, regardless of whether it's in the middle of Central Australia or in a Tasmanian forest in winter? How do you begin? What do you need to ask yourself when you find yourself stranded like that?
You need to ask yourself whether you're in a survival situation, and if you come up with the answer that yes, I am, well then you need to admit it to yourself, and then you need to change the whole outlook you have on the situation you're in and start surviving instead of just accepting it like it is.
What are the first things then you need to be thinking of?
You need to survey the situation. You need to look at where you are, what resources you have. Are you in a vehicle? Have you put in a flight plan with friends? Do people where you're going expect you to turn up on a certain time? What communication do you have? What other assets? Do you have water? You go through a whole mental list of things that would be nice to have, and then you check them against what you actually do have.
There's a rule of three that applies often in these situations, isn't there? Can you explain what that is?
So the rule of threes, and it's not always threes, but it's near enough. Without air, you'll last for 3 minutes. Without water, you'll last for 3 days. Without food, 3 weeks. And without a good mental attitude, you'll only last about 3 seconds.
You often say the day you decide that you're in a survival situation, that's the best you're going to feel. What do you mean by that?
So at that moment, you're as fit and healthy and hydrated as you're going to be over the next month. And so you need to use that to your advantage, because there's a good chance that you might not have a drink of water for a couple of days or a week. Unless you've got supplies with you, you won't have something to eat for 3 or 4 days. And so your body still keeps metabolising. You'll start losing weight and energy. And so there are a lot of things that you need to do in those first 2 or 3 days, because in a week's time, you will not have the energy to be able to do those.
Say you're stranded somewhere like in Arnhem Land. You've lived around there for large parts of your life, around Nhulunbuy, around there. If you're stranded in Arnhem Land, say during wet season, what's the first thing you need to be getting busy with once you're in a place like that?
Well, I mean, during the wet season, it's very likely that you have access to water, either from just the rain or the rivers that are near you. So water's not a priority. You know that there'll be plenty of water. So you might find that shelter is the main thing that you need. So you'll build a shelter with the resources you have. But at the same time, rescue is a high priority.
Given the crocs in the area, would you be looking to climb up a tree? Would that be the thing to use as a resting place, a place to sleep in?
Not really. I've slept in trees. They're very uncomfortable, and you don't need to climb up a tree. Like if you fall out of a boat and you're in a river, yes, you might have to climb up a tree to get out of the water. But if you were driving out of Nhulunbuy to say Katherine and you've broken down, you would know where the last river crossing is. And it's only if you're near a river crossing that you need to be careful with crocodiles. You know, if you're 100, 200 metres inland of a river, probably crocodiles are not your big concern. Flooding is probably more of a concern, and so you would, as a backup plan, not probably knowing the particular area, have a tree that in the middle of the night, if the water comes up 2 or 3 metres, you probably could climb, but climbing a tree and sleeping in a tree is not a big priority.
I've been to Iceland a couple of times, Steve, but I've never been so cold in my life as when I was in Cradle Mountain in Tasmania. People go hiking around there all the time, and if you got lost off a hiking track in that very different kind of an environment, a much, much colder environment like that, how would your priorities change in a place like that?
Oh, they would change significantly. The cold and being damp are your biggest enemy straight away. You've probably still got access to water, but food becomes a big concern because your body's metabolising to try and stay warm. And the more you get cold, the more your body tries to warm itself. So without food, that's very hard. And as part of that, you need to seek shelter, stay warm, get a fire going, get out of the wind. Yeah, the priorities are quite different.
Making a fire would obviously be important if you can. Are you able to do that thing about making fire with two sticks? Does that even work, rubbing two sticks together? Is that actually a thing, Steve?
Yes. It's a very important skill, and it's a skill that is a pass or a fail on military courses. And it looks very easy. To watch someone that's done it a number of times, it looks very easy, but there's quite a bit to it. The choice of wood, the setup, the preparation, and again, the positive mental attitude. But in most of the Asian and Pacific islands and countries, they all use wood of some description and different methods to light fire. They used to have a fire lighting competition here at the Darwin show, and I think the record was something like 17 seconds. They were using a particular wood and they would dry it out, they would have it out in the sun, they'd have a really good bird's nest and tinder and all the rest of it. So they've set themselves up for success, and they look like they rub the sticks 3 or 4 times. They get a small ember, and within seconds, 17 seconds, they have a flame, and it's just incredible to watch.
If you've got to keep moving, is it possible to take fire with you?
Yes. You set up a torch or something like that. However, that quite often is dependent on the elements. If it's raining, if it's windy, the fuel sources. There are easier ways. In the Northern Territory, we can use a swamp banksia seed, just light that, and it'll smoulder for hours and hours. If someone in your party's got a cigar, get them to light a cigar and just put it in a tin. It'll smoulder for half a day. There's a number of other woods. So down south, you've got your grass trees. If you light the seeded end of one of those pods, they will burn for hours and hours. Or something as simple as carrying a heap of coals in a steel bucket and then stopping every 4 or 5 kilometres to light a fire and then put fresh coals into that bucket. You can certainly carry coals a long distance.
There's something called a char cloth that people can use in these situations. Can you explain what that is and how it works and how you make it?
Char cloth is pretty simple to make, and it comes into the second fire theory where you've lit your original fire and you set yourself up for success so that if you have to light another fire a day or two later, you can rip off, say, the pocket on a cotton shirt or some rags out of the car, and you put them into a tin, put a small hole in the top and put them on the coals in a fire, and then the cotton that's in there will smoulder to the point where the smoke stops coming out of the hole, and at that point you take it off, let it cool, and you end up with this really delicate material that if you have, say, a cigarette lighter that has no gas in it anymore, if you flick that, the little spark that comes off that will land in the char cloth, and it's enough to actually, the char cloth to start smouldering, and from that you can nurture it enough to light a fire.
Like I said at the outset, one of the things you teach is celestial navigation in the bush. Tell me how you use a stick to teach people how to find their way in the southern hemisphere by the stars.
Sticks are a pretty important part of anything to do with navigation, but during the evening you carry a stick. Typically you try to get a white stick so that if you put it down, it's easier to find. And so with the stick you run it down through the centre of the long axis of the Southern Cross and then measure down the stick 4.5 times the length of the Southern Cross, and that's your south celestial point, and that's where all your stars will turn. And then you draw a line straight down to the horizon, and that is south. And then from south you can get north and east and west and so forth. And if you know that there's a road 20 kilometres to your north, but you know that you're heading north, and roughly 20 kilometres you'll run into that road. So that's how you sort of use that.
How much of what you teach is something you've learned from Indigenous knowledge that you've been able to incorporate into your bag of tricks, if you like?
So over the years, especially living in Nhulunbuy and places like that, and with the military, certainly making spears and understanding the land, being able to locate water, and being able to hunt on coastal areas. Like I've done operations with a lot of the lads from Owen Pally and Ramangini and Manangruta right across the northern part of Arnhem Land, and you take those guys out into the areas that they know, and you never have a bad day fishing. There's always food, there's always bush tucker. They'll certainly show you what is available locally.
What kind of bush tucker you got a taste for these days, Steve?
Years ago I used to like goanna, but we don't do that too much now simply because the cane toads have had such an impact on goanna. But when you're out with the local lads, they'll give you a try of, dugong or turtle eggs, things like that. Things that, you and I can't go and sample those things without their permission sort of thing.
You're a country boy, Steve. Where was the property you grew up on?
So I grew up just outside Colbinaban, which is south of Echuca, just a small sheep and cropping property there.
The country's lovely around there, though, isn't it? It's near the Murray, in other words.
Yes, just south of the Murray, yes.
Steve, I was 35 when I started driving. It was only when I had kids I started to drive. How old were you when you first got behind the wheel of a car?
Probably 5 or 6. Yeah.
How do you reach the pedals?
Dad put blocks of wood on the pedals, and quite often you'd have to slide off the seat to push one of the blocks of wood on the pedal and then jump back up and hope you haven't driven through the fence. So, yeah, I remember probably when I was 7, Dad needed to throw some hay out to the sheep because it was a bit of a lean year, and we were in the truck. And so Dad jumped in the truck and stood on the running board, put me in the seat, and put it in gear and let the clutch out and all the rest of it. And then he climbed up onto the truck to feed the hay out. And all I had to do was stand up on the seat and steer the steering wheel around things. And there was only one tree in the whole paddock, and I ran into it. So
what happened to Dad?
He come off, and we weren't on talking terms for a couple of hours.
Well, were you a bit of an adventurous kid on that property, trying all kinds of harebrained things to entertain yourself?
Oh, look, Mum went grey when I was about 7. Yeah, Mum used to pull her hair out.
There was a moment when you were a little kid and you got lost in the state forest next to your property. How did that happen?
Oh, yeah. I think from an early age I had, OCD or something like that. So concentrating on any one thing for more than 10 seconds was a real struggle. And back in those days, wherever we went, we had to take a dog with us. And so I had Rick, he was a Border Collie Kelpie cross, and we were in our home paddock, which is normally full of big eastern grey kangaroos. And then we get up there and we chase the kangaroos around, much to Dad's horror, because we'd had some dogs maimed by kangaroos and so forth. So, but across the road is this state forest, and it's just like a big lolly shop, and it must have been quite late in the day. And so we get into the bush, and I don't know how far into the bush we went, probably a kilometre perhaps.
This is just you and the dog, is it? Just
me and the dog, yeah. And then, of course, it starts getting dark, and I don't know where home is. I don't know anything about the Southern Cross and finding direction and all the rest of it. And we got stuck there. And so there was me and the dog on the ground, and me having a cry, and the dog keeping me warm.
I'm just imagining what it's like to spend the night out in the forest like that. I don't know how clear your memories would be because you're just a 6-year-old kid, but the canopy of the trees might have created one of those perfectly dark nights where you can't see your hand in front of you. Do you remember if it was like that?
I just remember it was really dark, and I know in the middle of the night the dog was right beside me, so I could feel the dog was warm, I could hear the dog breathing, and I could see stars, and I could see the Southern Cross. To this day, I've always, even when I've been overseas and other places, I look at the Southern Cross and go, there you go, mate, I know who you are, good to see you. But yeah, it was dark. It was terribly dark. And we curled up in some grass, and I just remember it was cold. And I don't know whether I was scared because I had the dog, but I knew that I was in trouble. I was in big, I was going to be in big trouble the next morning.
And when you came back home, your parents must have been beside themselves and so happy to see you walk out alive.
Yeah, look, I don't really remember it. Like I half expect that I walked into the shed and Dad would have been welding or something, and he probably wouldn't have even known that I was missing. Mum certainly had asked where I was and all the rest of it, and the dog looked at me and I looked at the dog, and we both knew we were in trouble, because I think Dad would have been more worried about where the dog was, because you weren't allowed to play with the dog because the dogs were working dogs and the dog hadn't come home for dinner. So I think the dog probably got into more trouble than me, but Mum was certainly concerned, yeah.
So you'd survived your first night in the bush alone as a 6-year-old. How did you continue to learn survival skills through your childhood?
When I was a scout, our scout leader at the time said, oh, well, we're going to run a bit of a survival weekend. And so we went up into the same forest where I got lost when I was little, and they put us out with a pound of flour, a jar of honey. We could take plenty of water. We had a bit of plastic, and we were dropped in on the Friday night, and we came out on the Sunday morning, and that was the very first type of survival instruction that I'd ever had. The scout leader would come around each morning, lunchtime and evening to make sure that we were all right, and asked whether he wanted to go home, and then he'd run little lessons on how to do certain things. And one of them that I remember distinctly was how to get the witchetty grubs out of an acacia tree, and I loved it. Yeah, to this day, still I get pretty excited thinking about it.
Talking to other people who can do this sort of thing, one of the things they sometimes tell me is that the pleasure of it is in extremely heightened attentiveness you have when you're in those situations. You're listening and smelling and seeing things with a kind of a clarity that is, it's almost ecstatic. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say that kind of thing?
Yeah. You change your whole. You look at, typically you get out of the car and you walk into the bush, and you see grass and you see trees. Well, when you're teaching bushcraft and survival, you look at the trees and you name them in your head. Oh yeah, I named that one, named that one, named that one. Oh, I don't know that one. What's that one? And so then you'll look it up in a book, and then you've learnt something, and then you go, right, I'm going to light a fire. And so you don't just go starting to find sticks and things. So you find rupoo and go, right, I can start my fire with this, and there's some nice fluffy grass, and you walk around, you end up with pockets and pockets full of stuff that, like on a normal day, would have no relevance to anything you're doing. But on a day where you've decided, I'm going to do bushcraft, you find it and you start reading the trees and the lay of the land. You go, right, if I need to signal someone, I'm going to signal from over there, and I can get a helicopter to land over here. And it looks like, I reckon there's a gully there, so I reckon halfway down there'll be a pool of water, and it just unfolds. It's like a big story map, just unfolds in front of your eyes. It's incredible.
See, I'm such a city boy, Steve. When I go into those places, I'm often awestruck, but I feel like an interloper, like someone from another country almost. Do you get that feeling of being part of it, though, being so familiar with some of these places?
Depends where you are. So around Darwin, the Northern Territory, I feel very comfortable with it all. But when I'm in other places, parts of New Guinea and parts of Borneo, I've done trips there this year, and I don't feel as comfortable, but at the same time, I write a list of notes, and when I come across someone that knows a bit more about it, I'll ask them, what's this? Can I eat this? Or can I light fire with this? The excitement I get from being out there is being out there with other people like yourself that openly admit that this is not for me, I don't know a great deal about it. And then just through guided discovery or asking them, what do you think's a priority? And they say fire. Well, okay, let's light a fire, and give them a box of matches and let them light a fire. And then the next day, give them a frisium rod and let them light fire. And then the next day, use a magnifying glass. And then towards the end of the week, find some sticks and let them rub. And to watch that person grow is just incredible. That's the bit that I really enjoy regarding bushcraft and survival skills.
So you're a Victorian originally, or well, from the border anyway. What inspired you to travel up to the Northern Territory, to Nhulunbuy and the Adelaide River for the first time?
So my grandfather on my mum's side was up here during the Second World War, and he was a bit of a storyteller, and he used to tell stories about Adelaide River. And as a little kid, I just used to sit there and lap them up. And so when I'd completed my third year of my apprenticeship, I would have been just 18, me and a mate drove up here to see what Pop talked about. And the construction company that he worked for a civilian construction company, and they built all the airstrips between Alice Springs and Darwin. And so as you're driving up, here's all these airstrips that my grandfather worked on, and he used to tell stories about when Darwin was bombed and people just turning up overnight that had walked from Darwin, civilians and military personnel turning up in Adelaide River.
Oh, my God. Walking from Darwin all the way down there.
100 kilometres. And one unit pretty much did it in a day and a half. They just, right, we're out of here, and they walked Adelaide River.
And how did your Victorian cold weather persona react to the heat, the humidity, that powerful experience you get when you go to that part of the world?
Oh, it loved it. It loved it. My skin hated it because I've only have two colours. I have white and I have red, and then I go back to white. So I'm not like mates of mine that are Maltese and they go out in the sun for 5 minutes and they turn a beautiful chocolate colour and they don't get burnt. But we stayed up here for a few weeks, and then I went home. I finished my apprenticeship. I applied for a number of jobs in the Northern Territory. I got an interview to join the police, but I also got a job in Nhulunbuy as a fitter, and so that's where I went. I went and worked on the mines on the Gove Peninsula for a number of years.
You went to America for some years as well, to North America, where you went on treks there. It's a whole different world over there and a whole different environment. Tell me about the climb you took up a glacier on Mount Rainier, that's near Seattle, isn't it?
Yeah, so from Seattle you can see Mount Rainier. It's just beautiful. It's 14,411 feet, and I was leading a 7.5-week trip from Denver, Colorado, up through the 14 western states. And as part of that, we would stop at Mount Rainier and use the Mount Rainier guides, and then we would take our group up onto the summit. And on the third attempt to climb it, I got to the top of Ingram Glacier. We're travelling in rope teams, so there'd be 5 or 6 people on a rope team. So you've got a 50-metre piece of rope. People are tied in at, say, 10-metre intervals.
Are you like climbing up a cliff face of ice, or is it more like a kind of a mound of ice, a gigantic mound of ice on this glacier?
The mountain itself is covered in snow, but there's one spot where you go along and up a rocky spur that sort of sticks out of the glacier and then across the very top of it before you get onto hard-packed snow again to get to the summit. So at any one time, when you're going for the summit, you're climbing at night. There was my 2 teams, my team and another guide from the expedition that I was working on. And then you climb at night so that the snow is solid. It's better for your crampons and it's easier to navigate at night. And the particular night was very dark. Everyone's using headlamps. You're on white snow, so you can pretty much see the whole mountain, but at the same time you see all these lights travelling up a line. You've got the northern lights and a full moon to the north, just faintly. And then there's probably 3 or 4 rope teams behind us and 2 or 3 rope teams ahead of us.
And what happened to you as you were going up?
We were part way up this rocky area at the top of the Ingram Glacier, and then directly adjacent to that is a crevasse that sort of goes off to the side. And a call was made by one of the rope teams in front of us, rock, and it was yelled in such a way that it was pretty urgent.
Are you talking about like a boulder tumbling down the side of this glacier?
Yeah, about the size of a 20-litre drum. The training that we'd been through dictates that instead of just putting your head against the wall and hunkering down, you need to look for the rock, because by putting your head against the wall and not looking, the rock's likely to hit you.
Could you see it tumbling down?
I could see it briefly. It's only a split second, and then so you see it, and then you sort of manoeuvre to miss it. But it hit me on the left shoulder, and with that, it just picked me up and threw me about 3 metres into a crevasse tied to 5 other people.
And what were they doing while you were flung into this crevasse?
So 4 of them had done what we had taught them in their training. So they got down on the ground with their ice axes and dug them in. One person just stood there and sort of cried a little bit, whatever, but it was enough that those 4 people got down, and as a result it stopped me from sliding any further into the crevasse. And so I stuck my ice axe into the side of the crevasse, put the toes of my crampons into that, and so I didn't fall any further.
So you got pulled out. Are you carrying any scars from that, Steve?
Yeah, I've still got a big scar on my left shoulder. Yeah, it's been there a long time.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler.
So after America, you came back to live in the Northern Territory, Steve, where you joined something called Norforce. Now, I've never heard of Norforce. The more I've looked into it, it seems like a really significant institution. Tell me what Norforce is.
So Norforce is the Northwest Mobile Force. It's a reserve army unit, and we do reconnaissance and surveillance of the northern parts of Australia. We were formed in 1981 when a need was identified that we needed more surveillance in the northern parts of Australia.
But its history goes back to World War II, doesn't it?
That's correct, yeah. We have a strong connection to the Northern Australian Observer Unit, which affectionately were known as the Knackaroos. They were formed in 1942 to do a very similar job, the defence of Northern Australia during the war. And we also have a connection to the Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit that did a very similar role throughout the Northern Territory.
So its role at the moment is one for surveillance. What are you looking out for, like smugglers, drug smugglers, people smugglers, pirates and the like around the North Coast?
Pretty much. I mean, anything that's unusual, people coming into Australia illegally, people going out of Australia illegally, smuggling of flora and fauna, drugs, all of those sorts of things.
Is Norforce also like one of those stay-behind forces? For example, if the treacherous Kiwis finally did invade Australia from the north, hypothetically, if that happened, would Norforce be one of those kind of stay-behind embedded forces that would sort of disappear into the countryside and stay behind to act as a guerrilla force to harass an invading power?
Yes, yeah. So we would disappear somewhere or different places in the Northern Territory and continue to report on activity in the area, whether it's the invaders or whatever, and then on opportunity become a bit of a thorn in the side for them.
What kind of course did they put you on?
I've done a number of courses over the years. You know, you do your initial recruit course, then a patrol course, so that teaches you basic skills as a Norforce soldier. And then after that, you either become a medic or a radio operator. So I went down the medical stream. After each course, you go and do another patrol, operational patrol, and then once you've done your specialty skills, you'll do an insertion course, so either boats or vehicles. And then once you've got experience up over a few years, if you're someone that they think has the aptitude and skills, you might get to do a survival instructor course or a survival course.
And that was you?
Yeah, I got tapped on the shoulder and asked if I was interested in doing a survival instructor course.
What happens when you go through that?
My course was 3 weeks long, and it was run on a cattle property out in the Daly River area. And by the end of it, I was 16 kilos lighter, but it was good. And I think I learnt quite a lot from that course, and I also refined a lot of what I had on that course, and I also learnt how to articulate a lot of what I already knew and how to apply it to the survival side of things and instruct. It was pretty exciting, and to this day I'm still involved in those courses.
You've walked along the Kokoda Trek many times and you've taken veterans and descendants of veterans along it, and I know that's something you absolutely love doing. Tell me how you came to take 3 elderly brothers out to a remote grave in Lae on the northeast coast of Papua New Guinea.
So where I grew up, the three brothers, I went to school with the youngest brother, and we happened to be talking on the phone a couple of years ago about their mum's brother, their uncle, and how he was with 29 Commando and that he's buried in Lae somewhere. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting. I'm going to New Guinea in a month's time. If I get some spare time, I'll go up to Lae and see if I can find his grave for you. Finding the grave was quite easy because I could look it up on the internet, but the place is just immaculate. It's like any of those graves that you visit in Gallipoli or the Somme. It's just immaculate. So I found the grave, and when I got home, sent those photos through to the brothers.
And what did they tell you once you showed them the photos?
Well, they were pretty excited because they knew very little about their uncle, and because I get sort of caught up in it. I looked up the history of the unit, and I actually found the incident report where him and one of the other troopers and also the patrol commander were killed in action, and found that all three of them are buried side by side. And so I did more research, supplied that to the guys, and then the oldest brother said, right, well, what do you think? Would we be able to go over and have a look? And I'm like, yeah, no worries at all. I'll come with you. And so it took about 2 years to get all the ducks in a row and the guys get passports and bit by bit. But in June this year, we went over.
What are the logistics of taking three elderly men out to a place like Lae?
Oh, Lae's a bit of a wild spot. And so, flights, it's not hard to get there. So we had flights booked. Luckily, the family have connections in the travel industry, so the flights were all booked. I booked a security team through some people that I know over there. So we got picked up at the Lae airport by a security team. I'd talked to some people that I know within the army that were deployed to Lae at the time, and when we got to the cemetery, we had a young captain in uniform turn up there. So it went really well. The only person that didn't turn up was the Catholic priest. I think they were just busy. There was a bit going on.
Right, bit going on. What did they do once they got to the gravesite, the three nephews of this fallen commando?
The young captain took them around the whole of the graveyard, and the guys got to see a couple of VC winners and some stories. And then he was, excuse me, I get a bit emotional about this. He walked us around an edge of the graves, and then we turned up at their uncle's grave and said, "All right, guys, this is your uncle." Incredible. For those guys, it was very emotional. For I think anyone that was there. Then we held a formal memorial. So as per the protocols, Reveille and the Last Post and the PNG national anthem, the Australian national anthem, and we had photos of all three because we were honouring all three members that died that day. And then at the end of that, I said, right, well, that completes the formal part of the memorial. Now we move on to the informal. And they all looked at me and I went, yeah, just hang on. And so I had 6 cans of cold South Pacific beer in a backpack there, and we all had a can, and we put a can on each of the graves. And when we toasted, we tipped their beers over and we had a drink. I'd communicated with the Lae Yacht Club and talked to a fella there that was running the place. So we went back there and had a few beers. It was a really, yeah, for those guys, it was a one-off trip that they were very happy to do. And for me, it was probably one of the most rewarding trips I've ever done. We flew back to Moresby the next day, and then over the next 2 or 3 days, we did, a fishing trip. We went out to the Kokoda trailhead so that they could see that. We visited another war cemetery on the Port Moresby side. But yeah, they had a great trip.
In 2001, Steve, you were in the Himalayas as part of an expedition. What was the expedition about and what was your role in it?
So I was the base camp and advanced base camp manager for the 2001 Army Alpine Association Everest trip to climb to the top of Everest from the Tibetan side.
Was part of the plan that you would get to the summit of Everest yourself?
No, there was no. I mean, I've done quite a lot of mountaineering, such as Mount Rainier and some other mountains, but high altitude mountaineering is a different game. We had 13 climbers on that trip that had all climbed at least one 8,000 metre peak, and those guys had pretty much trained for that. So my job was to get 12 tonne of gear, 23 people from Australia to Nepal, lead the lead-up training on the Nepalese side, and then pick up the support staff in Kathmandu, load it all onto 2 trucks, and then get it across into Tibet to a base camp at 5,400 metres, and then move what stores we needed up to 6,400 metres on the side of Mt Everest. So during the lead-up training in Nepal, in the Annapurna Sanctuary, we had stayed the night in a small little village called Dharauli, and then the next day we moved as a group up to Michapachari Base Camp and stayed there the evening. And then the next morning, as a part of the acclimatisation, we were going to move another 500 metres higher up to Annapurna Base Camp. But that morning, the photographer for our expedition, who was a squadron leader, asked me if he could move back down the mountain instead of going up to get more footage of where they'd been. So his girlfriend, who was a flight sergeant at the time, and her daughter, who was about 8 years old, I said they could go back down. I ran that by the expedition leader and he was happy with that. So they were going to move back down and meet us a couple of villages down on our way back, because we were going to get up to Annapurna and out the next day. But when they moved down through the valley just before Dharauli, about 300 tonne of hard-packed ice came off the top of a big rock slide sort of thing and landed right on them, and all 3 of them perished, along with a girl from Israel. One other girl from Israel managed to dig herself out, and when we got back from the Annapurna base camp, we were made aware of it, and that was not good.
Had you heard this, what do you call it, a snowslide or a landslide? Had you had any intimation of that while you were off with your group, Steve?
No, we heard nothing, and I mean the weather was reasonably fine. There was nothing to say that was going to happen, and from information that I received a year or 2 years later, it looks like that ice had slid down this couloir from 1 or 2 kilometres away. So there was no way you would have ever known that was possible.
Did you go to the site and see what had happened once all that ice and snow had come down?
Yeah, so we got to the site the next morning. There were some villages there. They didn't go on to the area. But yeah, there was a massive amount of really hard-packed snow, and the basic digging implements that we had, entrenching tools and a couple of shovels and that, like they wouldn't even put a dent into the ice. It was so hard, and just the feeling of helplessness, it was terrible. And as a team, the whole team was just gutted.
Was there talk about ending the expedition after that?
We didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, we sent a couple of guys that were good with satellite phones. We sent them further down the mountain. They found a place that had power so they could power up. They let Defence know back in Australia, and then we moved down the mountain. 2 of the bodies were found next day by the Nepalese army. And we ended up back in Kathmandu, but at that stage the trip had pretty much been put on hold, and we all thought that that's the end of the trip.
Did you want to continue though, nonetheless?
Yeah, I certainly did. I think my feelings at the time were very, very selfish and self-centered, and I still, think sometimes that how I felt. My feelings were, how dare you get killed? I've trained too hard to be here. Yeah, it took me years to get over feeling that way. Like, just, I think about it now, I'm like, that's just terrible. Why did you think that? But that's, I'd trained for 6 months to get there, and when we were put on hold, yeah, that was really hard. But at the same time, it was, for the whole team, it was hard, and there were members of the team that had never experienced, a loss. They had all their grandparents and their mums and dads, everyone. They've never been to a funeral. Me, on the other hand, I'd been a pallbearer, 8 or 10 or 12 times before I was 21, with mates getting killed in car accidents and grandparents dying, and so my whole view was very different. And again, it was pretty self-centered and selfish. But
maybe you were in survivalist mode, where you kind of got to be unemotional and very pragmatic. Maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, if and I was. Don't worry, I was doing a good job of it too. And we had media organisations contacting us, and we had a media liaison person dealing with that, and then the team was dealing with our own internal grief. We had quite a bit to do with the Australian Embassy, and we used the church at the English Embassy to have a service, and there was some people sent over from the Australian Defence Force to do some grief counselling and stuff like that. But yeah, it was a hard time for everyone, and I think an especially hard time for the expedition leader and the 2IC of the expedition, who were senior ranked and needed to liaise with their next of kin and also with senior levels of defence.
So you decided to go on up after a while to get to the advanced base camp. How did that unfold, Steve?
So we got permission to move into Tibet. So it took us about a week to get into Tibet and up to base camp and set everything up. We had some massive tents that we set up at base camp, and I mean, setting a tent, an 11 by 11 joined to 2 other 11 by 11s on a good day is hard enough, but doing it at altitude with predominantly officers, it was even harder. But we got it up. Once everything was set up, we started ferrying equipment and members of the team up to advanced base camp, and then I went up to advanced base camp about a week later. And
what happened to you as you were moving up like that?
Well, yeah, a couple of things happened. I left interim camp. We had a small camp halfway up that just had a few supplies and an area that you could stay the night. I left with a couple of guys from an English expedition, but I had a really sore throat and feeling a bit crook, probably a little bit altitude sickness. But as I was walking up, there's a bit of a trail, follows this massive big glacier, and I got to a point where I could either go right or go left, and it was just me. So I stayed there for a minute or two, and then I heard yak bells coming from the left, and I thought, well, that's the right way to go. So,
what was visibility like if you're listening for yak bells at this point?
Well, the weather was starting to close in, so there was a storm coming, but I needed to keep going because I either had to keep going or go back down to interim camp. So I kept going, but about 40 minutes later, I fell into another crevasse.
I shouldn't laugh, but
story of my life.
Crevasses are your enemies, aren't they, Steve? They're not your friends, are they?
We've agreed to disagree. But falling in the crevasse, and it was only a couple of metres deep, so and it was more of a oops, slip down it like you're in it, and at that point I'm like, oh, oh, it's nice and warm in here. You know, there's no wind, and so I could adjust my down suit. I could put my crampons on, put a few more layers on, and all the rest of it. So took my time, had a drink of water, had a muesli bar, and then just climbed out of the crevasse and kept going, heading up towards advanced base camp at 6,400 metres.
How much daylight did you have left at that point?
There was probably only 40 minutes left. As I kept going, it just got darker and darker until it was almost completely dark. And at that point, I thought, well, I'm either going to have to dig a hole and get in it for the night. I had a watch, so I had a Suntu watch at the time, and it showed that I was at 6,200 metres. So I got the radio out that I had, but when I turned it on, the battery was blinking to show that it was, you know, no power or whatever. But I think it was just cold, so I'm sticking it under my arms and near my groin, trying to get it warmed up. And when I got the radio going, I was saying, "Advanced Base Camp, this is Steve." And I couldn't hear anything. And then as I was about to pack the radio up, I heard a voice saying, "Unknown call sign, this is Advanced Base Camp, over." And because I tried to talk back and they couldn't hear me. And then straight away, the guy that was on the other end, knew more about radios than I ever did, said, "Right, we know someone's out there. We don't know who it is, and we know that you don't have the power. If you can hear us, can you push your mic button twice?" And so I pushed it twice, and they went, "Okay, so I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and each time a question is yes, push it twice, and each time a question is no, push it once." And so they went through a whole heap of questions, and so the first question was, "Is that you, Steve?" And I went, I pushed it twice, and they go, "Okay, are you on the trail?" "Yes." Pushed it twice, and then they started going through the altitude. "Are you above 6,100 metres?" Pushed it twice. "Are you above 6,200 metres?" Pushed it twice. And then they go, "Okay, wait where you are. We'll send 2 Sherpas down." And so I reckon probably 35 minutes later, these 2 tall, high-altitude Sherpas come bounding down through the snow. Just picked me up like I was a rag doll. They pulled out their thermos of hot tang. I don't know whether you've ever had tang, but in the mountains they make tang up in thermoses and they heat it up. And so they give me this mouthful of tang, and then one of them took my backpack off and said, "We go," and off we went. And so I reckon an hour and a half later, I was in the tent at Advanced Base Camp, and everyone's quizzing me. And I said to them, "Well, it's only that I heard the yak bells that I went to the left. Otherwise, I would have gone to the right." And the expedition leader said, "There hasn't been any yaks up here for a week."
What were you hearing then? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. I think it was the survival brain saying, "Go left."
Right.
So, yeah.
Could have been a Yeti.
Oh, who knows? Nothing would have surprised me that day.
Having this knowledge and being in those situations, does that now mean you're someone who is free of fear?
Oh, no. I think, I still get scared. I don't get scared very often, but I'm not scared of being in the bush, and I get scared of other things. I'm not big on crowds anymore. Yeah, it's sort of weird. It sort of manifests itself in a different way I think it's more apprehensive than scared. I don't think I get scared. I used to look forward to being scared because then I had to figure things out and work through it and stuff like that. But now I think it's just getting older. Even hanging off a rope. I got up on the roof the other day. I live in an elevated house, and I got up on the roof, and I've got thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of climbing equipment, and I set it all up, and I look very professional when I've got all this stuff dangling off me off the roof. But there was a moment there where I'm tied to a rope, and one of the carabiners sort of clipped over, and I slipped about an inch on the roof, and at that point I thought, oh, and that gave me a fright, and I haven't felt that for a while, but I'm glad that I still have it. I was just surprised that it come up like that.
You know, one of the things that people who live in urban environments have succeeded in doing, particularly in the last 15, 20 years with smartphones, is the total destruction of boredom. We have a smartphone to entertain us at any given moment when we're in a queue for anything, if we're waiting for the bus or what have you. But with that destruction, there's kind of a destruction of reflection too. But you would have had a lot of time to reflect on so many things in life, being out there somewhere in the middle of nowhere, time to think, time to go over things. What do you think about all that, Steve?
The mobile phone stuff, yeah, you're exactly right. And it's a shame, but that's just how it is. But for me, whenever I go away on a trip, I keep a diary. Even after I've had a few beers in the Lay Yacht Club or somewhere like that, I'll write in it. And it's not until you get home, because, I've just had 7 days in New Guinea with these guys. It's a great trip. And you read back through, you're scratching on a piece of paper and all the rest of it, and you read it and you go, oh, that's not bad. That's pretty good. Like, we don't write letters to people anymore. We send emails and they're very carefully edited and that. But I've got a mate in Perth, an older gentleman, that we still exchange 1 or 2 letters a year, and his handwriting is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. But the way that he phrases things and doesn't scribble things out, like he's all over it. So, yeah, I think the mobile phone has taken a lot away from us. But if you fight to hang on to it, so me keeping a diary, sitting on the Douglas River or the Daly River, trying to catch a fish, and then writing something about, just describing the scenery and stuff like that. Like, that's real Banjo Patterson stuff, or Henry Lawson. That's how those guys all wrote. I like to do that sometimes. I don't do enough of it, but I'm still one that gets caught up in the mobile thing and does a bit of that too.
Steve, it's been completely brilliant speaking with you, and such a pleasure. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Today's conversation was produced on the lands of the Gadigal, Turrbal and Jagera peoples. Producer is Rebecca McLaren. Our executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Fiedler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Fiedler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Someone handed me a secret recording.
We've got to get rid of all those loose ends, okay?
For years now, I've been investigating this guy.
What, you stab her in the neck with a knife?
He's known as Mr. Big. His tentacles spread to the very heart of the justice system.
I don't just need it under the carpet, I need it to be fixed.
I'm Alicia Bridges. I find out who he really is in Mr. Big, a new true crime podcast from Unravel. Search for Unravel now on the ABC Listen app.